Have you ever wondered why we even need an income tax and an internal revenue service? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we address that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for liberty and libertarianism. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Great to be with you and our viewers and listeners in these boring and uninteresting times.
Yeah, we have been cursed with some interesting times. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, you can come and grab 30 years worth of articles and videos and presentations. And Richard was certainly at the start of FFF. He was the vice president of academic affairs before he went on to bigger and better things as the Foundation for Economic Education president. And now he's here at the Citadel. And so you can also subscribe, of course, to our YouTube channel. All right, Richard, in all the times we've been doing this series, I don't think we've ever done a particular segment on income taxation. So I thought, well, hey, let's discuss income taxation. I mean, this is the major funding vehicle for the massive welfare state and warfare state under which we live, along, of course, with the Federal Reserve. So, let's talk about this. If we go back in American history, we know that the American people rejected the idea of income taxation. When the country first got started, when the federal government got called into existence with the Constitution, the framers made it clear that there was going to be no income taxation, which they called direct taxes. That remember that the Articles of Confederation, under which Americans had operated for over 10 years before the Constitutional Convention, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax at all. I mean, imagine living under a federal government that doesn't have the power to tax. So when they go into the Constitutional Convention, their aim was to just modify the articles. There had been some problems with it, but they come out with this whole new governmental proposal for what's called a limited government republic with just a basic military force funded through taxation. And people were very leery of this, but the framers said, look, it's not going to be a direct tax like having an internal revenue service, which is a very big assault on an individual. That we're going to have indirect taxes like excise taxes and tariffs and so forth, which do involve the initiation of force to fund the government, but they're not as intrusive as the income tax or a direct tax. So for 100 years, I mean, this shocks a lot of Americans when they learn this. They think that we've had the same kind of system in America for the whole 225 years or whatever. But on the contrary, for more than 100 years, Americans live without income taxation and an IRS. I mean, you kept everything you earned. If you made it, you kept it. And nobody was forced to share the money. Like there was no forced coercive welfare state programs, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, education grants, farm subsidies, none of this. That charity was entirely voluntary. And the interesting result of this, Americans inadvertently discovered the causes of wealth in a society, of rising standards of living. If you go down to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when this system of massive savings, because people were saving a large portion of their income. I mean, imagine if there was no withholding, where you keep 100% of what you earned. The natural proclivity is to save a large portion of that money. So in an emergency or crisis, you've got savings in there that can tide you over, unlike today when millions of Americans don't have even 1 month's worth of savings in there. Well, Americans discovered that this massive savings system resulted in the accumulation of capital. A farmer could go to the bank. People would put their savings in banks, and the farmer would go there and say, can you lend me some money to buy a tractor? And the banker says, well, it just so happens that a lot of your workers are putting their savings in my bank. I can lend you the money. The guy goes out and buys a tractor. All of a sudden, his workers are producing 10,000 bushels of wheat instead of 1,000 bushels. He's got revenue coming in. He's got more money to pay wages. Everybody else is doing this, so competition increases the wage rates. Everybody's prospering. So by the late 1800s, 1900s, people were marveling at this system all over the world. Americans had discovered what the causes of rising standards of living were, along with sound money and other factors. And then also, ironically, the most charitable nation in history. When nobody was forced to take care of other people, you had more charity activity than you can imagine. Voluntary groups doing this, voluntary groups doing that. And then all of a sudden, there's this sea change in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, along with foreign policy. You know, they intervene in the Spanish-American War, they intervene in World War I. But in 1913, the die was cast, and that was the official adoption with the 16th Amendment of the income tax. Everything changes at that point. The citizen is no longer the master, and the government is the servant. Now the relationship is inverted. The government becomes the master. The citizen becomes the servant. The government decides what percentage of income people will be permitted to keep, like an allowance. And, starts out with just plundering the rich. That was how it got sold. But before long, World War I, World War II, the growing welfare state, I mean, everything changes where the government starts, confiscating massive amounts of what would have been savings. And that was the beginning of the end in terms of enormously rising standards of living. Now, the standard of living of the American people kept growing faster than what they were taking in terms of seizure of savings, and there were huge improvements like computers that were accelerating productivity and so forth. But it just boggles the mind to think what life would have been like in the United States had that trajectory continued. And now here's where we are today. We're massive confiscation of wealth by the IRS, along with the Federal Reserve, which of course was established in the same year as the income tax, 1913, where people barely have savings to get by, or at least millions of Americans. You've got massive debt by the government, which taxpayers are responsible for. Each taxpayer owes his proportionate share is $200,000 per taxpayer. And you've got this intergenerational conflicts. You've got conflicts among society. It's Frederick Bastiat's famous dictum: the state becomes the great fiction under this kind of system where everyone's trying to live at the expense of everyone else. What do you think?
Well, the nature of the system is often portrayed as April 15th. Of course, not April 15th this year because they've moved it further into the summer. But normally around April 15th, you see this cartoon in newspapers or on the webs inside internet, and it's a mock income tax form, and it has your name, it has your address, and it says how much did you earn, and it says send it in. That's it. Like everything you've earned, you owe to the government. Now that satire, that sort of joke, is what you're getting at. And that is that the income tax changed the entire institutional framework in which government was traditionally limited in what it did and what the people expected to be able to keep in their own pockets. For example, in 1913, the year that the income tax amendment was brought into effect, all levels of government, took in approximately 8% of national income. That meant that the people kept 92% of everything that they had earned. The other element of this, Jacob, was that again in 1913, what was the composition of that 8% of national income? In fact, 5% was spent by state and local governments, and only 3% was spent by the federal government. Now, that's primarily because the government was doing so much less back then. Now, you might say, where did the money come from? And you were alluding to this. Where did the money come from to be doing what it did at the federal level? Well, basically, before 1913, the federal government had three sources of taxes, which also you mentioned. First of all, there was excise taxes, basically what today we call sin taxes. Some federal taxes on alcohol, some federal taxes on cigarettes, and so on. Then there was land sales. The federal government had these huge stretches of territories, which slowly but surely it was selling off. federal lands. And that was another component of the sources of federal revenue. And then the third one was import duties, excise taxes on imported goods, tariffs. Now, while America had a seesaw history in the 19th century, high tariffs for trade protectionism of domestic industries, followed by relatively low tariffs that were just meant to be a revenue source. Like think of it as a low sales tax, just so the government has the resources, the financial resources it needs. But that was basically in 1913, a relatively modest import duty by historical standards, land sales, and some sin taxes in the form of domestic excise taxes. And that's all. Now, since those are the only sources of income for the federal government, and since at that time the federal government operated on what other economists later called an unwritten fiscal constitution, because there's nothing in the US Constitution that requires the federal government to run a balanced budget. Most state constitutions require that of the state, but there's nothing in the federal Constitution. But in spite of it not being there as one of the clauses in the Constitution, the federal government basically followed that unwritten rule that except during national emergencies, which usually meant wars, the government tried to keep its expenditures within the taxes it could collect from those few and narrow sources. And if a national emergency came about, again, almost always wars of the 19th century, the War of 1812, the Mexican War of 1846, the Civil War, the much shorter and minute Spanish-American War of 1898, and so on, the government would then run budget surpluses to be paying off the debt. And while Andrew Jackson is often considered a somewhat controversial figure in American history, the fact is when he was president in the 1830s, he prided himself on one particular success during his presidency. He got the national debt down to virtually zero. Now, all of this changed, Jacob, with the coming of the income tax amendment, because now the federal government had a direct source to the people's wealth. You see, if you have an excise tax, like on cigarettes and alcohol, well, it's dependent upon how high it is, and therefore whether you dissuade people from legally buying cigarettes and alcohol, for instance, as opposed to doing black market activity. And the same thing with import duties. If you raise the import duty too high, that makes it unattractive to buy the foreign goods, and then you're taking in less tariff revenues. And of course, the land sales depend upon, the movement west. But the fact is that this basically meant that the government had to constrain itself narrowly. But once the income tax came into effect, the government could set it at any level. Now, from an historical context, there was an American new weekly magazine, sort of like a Time or a Newsweek or U.S. News back then, called Literary Digest. And I once looked up a bunch of old issues from those early part of the 20th century. And one of them was when this debate was going on about whether we should pass the 16th Amendment. And what were the opponents of the 16th Amendment saying? Oh, this is serious. If we pass this 16th Amendment, income tax will become confiscatory. The wealth of the people will be siphoned away from them. Why? The income tax could go as high as 5%. Oh, no. Oh, the horror of 5%. From as my grandmother would say, from your mouth into God's ears, I wish it was only 5%. But anyway, but that was the attitude. But you see, once it was instituted, this now became an avenue for the government to be able to siphon off more and more wealth. See, because the line at the time, and you were alluding to this, Jacob, at the time it was instituted, it's really just going to be the wealthy people. And even that was a very small sliver of what today would be pejoratively called the 1%. Most people kept their income, but you see, as the 1930s came in, and then the war years of the 1940s, The tax burdens not only were raised higher on, quote, the rich, but began to be set up for brackets into the lowering levels of the middle class. Until, but you see, there was always the danger of people revolting against it, because most Americans don't realize that. But up until during the war years of the 1940s, you paid your income tax as a lump sum on April 15th. But what happened in World War II, and this was always viewed as the shame of Milton Friedman, the well-known free market economist, or at least as his wife would always pejoratively be accusatory about with him. He was an economist working in the U.S. government during World War II. And how are they going to get enough tax revenues coming in to fund the war activities, right? You're fighting the Nazis, the Japanese. So what was suggested is, as a wartime temporary emergency, you'd have withholding tax. You wouldn't wait till the 15th and figure out what you owed and send it all in a lump sum. The government would start withholding it from salaries, from paychecks. Now, the special danger of this, Jacob, is that once, and of course, I guess some people in Washington still think that World War II is going on, because withholding a national emergency tax seems to still be going on, at least last time I looked at my pay stub. But anyway, what this was basically saying, what this basically did, is that once government could be siphoning off part of your income before you even see your check, or as they used to do, pay you in cash, you lose any sense of how much the government is taking. Like many people, I get direct deposit. And so every 2 weeks, as the Citadel pays me as a faculty member, the check automatically appears in my bank account with the bank I deal with. And I think that's my income for 2 weeks, what then we work out as a month. And I just think that is my income. And even though, I'm one of these people who like talking about this, I'm very aware of what the government is doing. It becomes a habit that you just assume that's your income when it is not. Because if you take the real print stub or the electronic one you can get from your employer's website, as I can do with the Citadel, see how much they're taking. Income tax, Social Security tax, unemployment insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, state income tax, if you're one of the states, live in a state that has an income tax. If you're working in New York City, and therefore a resident of New York City, a city income tax. And only when you actually look at that, it jolts you back to awareness of how much your gross is and how much the levels of government kindly, generously, benevolently let you keep. And that gives the government an access to wealth at literally its source. You earning it and siphoning off a portion before you even see a dollar of what you're allowed to keep. Now, I just one more point on Jacob, that if I may. It's also the progressivity of the income tax. The idea is that the idea was ability to pay. The wealthier you are, the more you should pay. So the more the wealthier you become, or the higher your income comes in terms of the tax brackets, at the margin you pay more out of each additional dollar you earn. So what happens to the ability to accumulate wealth in trying to earn more? What happens to the incentive, as the supply side economists would like to say, to work, save, and invest? All of this is diminished. And you see, the thing is that even if there's an income tax, if you earn $10,000, what's 10%? 1,000. If you earn $1 million, what's 10%? $100,000. You still end up paying more if your gross income is bigger. But not only that, because of the envy element and the government's greed to pick people's pockets even more, they make it progressive. They rationalize it on inequality ideology reasons, and then they have a greater source of wealth to take more out of what people have honestly earned and are attempting to accumulate. It is, as the great libertarian writer wrote, the income tax, Frank Charterov, the root of all evil. is the basis upon which the government has the rationale and the ability and the institutional capacity to take, in principle, everything you earn if it were to be so desired.
Yeah, Shodorov's book is heroic. I mean, written in 1954.
Yes.
And Shodorov is there talking about the movement towards socialism and how, libertarians need to stand up and take a stand. And in the last part of the book, it's so heroic. He says, it's not whether we win the fight or not. He says it would be nice to win the fight to restore liberty to our land, and an essential prerequisite to a free society is the abolition of the income tax. But he says these are times that call for leadership in libertarian circles, that as long as we fight for these principles, that's what matters, because we send a message to the new generations coming after us that these are things worth fighting for. And unfortunately, Richard, all too many people have thrown in the towel on this battle. It was a big battle for that 16th Amendment. I mean, they were the progressives were trying to get income taxation in throughout the 1800s. I mean, during the Lincoln administration, they enacted an income tax, and the Supreme Court, when it finally reached there, said, no, this violates the Constitution that the people have enacted, and declared it unconstitutional. But then the movement continued. There was this movement for progressivism, socialism, Social Security, national health care, minimum wage laws, and then part of that was this interventionist foreign policy, imperialism, acquiring colonies, which was the Spanish-American War in 1898. It moves up to 1913. Throughout this time, conservatives were opposing these things. It was a huge, or you could call them libertarians. There was a huge battle, including in judicial circles. There was, by the time the battle culminates in the 1930s, there was what were called the Four Horsemen on the Supreme Court, who were declaring much of what Roosevelt was doing with the income tax money, converting America from a free market private property system to what was known as a welfare state. And there were people battling against this. Conservatives were saying, this is going to destroy America. It's going to destroy freedom. But by the end of it, you still have conservatives still fighting, like all the way up to Lyndon Johnson's administration, where Medicare and Medicaid were adopted, which were expanding what Roosevelt had started. Conservatives were still fighting, pointing out this is socialism. But then Johnson smashes Barry Goldwater in the 64 race. And Goldwater, in his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, was opposing this stuff. I mean, saying that this is the socialist direction, is destroying our country. The country is collapsing from within. But then Johnson smashes him, takes, 61% of the vote, carried virtually every state. I think there was one or two that Goldwater carried. And at that point, it was fascinating, because the conservatives said, you know what? If we're going to be players in this game, we have to just throw in the towel and accept the premises of the welfare and the warfare state. And that's when they became supporters of the Vietnam War. And of course, they'd already been supporters of the whole Cold War atmosphere, the national security state, abandoning limited government principles. But mostly on the welfare state, it was, we have to become like them. And we have to be a player in this. And to be a player in the political game, we have to now become ardent supporters of the welfare state. I mean, they just abandoned all their principles and accepted the premises of what had happened to America. And that's why I think people like Shodorov were just so heroic that stood in there. I mean, another example of this type of heroism is Frederick Bastiat. You recall that nice little book that George Roach, the former president of Hillsdale College, wrote, Frederick Bastiat, A Man Alone. And what he was saying is that he wasn't saying Bastiat didn't have friends or anything. He got elected to the parliament. It's saying that he was willing to stand for his principles even against his entire country. Didn't matter. That there's that heroism of standing for what's right. And unfortunately, that's been lost among conservatives as well as progressives. And the only ones that are really left standing, this light shining in this darkness, are us libertarians. And if that light goes out, if we throw in the towel and start supporting income taxation and welfare for everybody and welfare for this and the warfare state, this light that's shining through this darkness is extinguished. Then we become like them, and that would be an absolute disaster. I mean, what's so uplifting is that there are still libertarians that are battling against this thing, and that's that light that's shining through and brightening this darkness that we're living under.
Yes, you see, I think it's important to particularly emphasize what you were saying is that after Goldwater's defeat, there was an attitude among many conservatives that the welfare state was here to stay. It was Don Quixote tilting at windmills, attempting to fight it. In fact, there was a very well-known conservative columnist, journalist, commentator named Fred Barnes. And I believe it was in the American Spectator at one point, wrote an article called The Case for Big Government Conservatism. And that article stuck in my head because he basically was saying that. It is clear we will never dismantle the welfare state. It is clear we're never going to get rid of government in terms of its intrusiveness and size. So what we have to do is to take over the government and see that it is managed efficiently and that government power is used in better directions that are based more on conservative and traditionalist principles than the progressives and the wild-eyed Democratic Party radicals who would destroy us for following a road to socialism. So, and that unfortunately, maybe not stated as explicitly and honestly as Fred Barnes in that article, that has been the tone that most, if not all, conservatives of any prominence on the political scene have basically been saying now for well over 30 years. The attitude is that you have to go along to get along. And all we can try to do is to slow it down, manage it efficiently, see that the debt doesn't become larger than it has to be because it's going to keep growing, and just try to figure out some way to partly privatize or better manage Social Security so it's financially sound for the next generation of retirees. Now, if that's all the conservatism represents, and alas, I think that for the most part it really is that, then it is not an exaggeration, as many on the left have said for a long time, that conservatism is bankrupt because it has nothing to offer. Where is the vision of liberty? Where is the vision of limited government and wide open competitive dynamic capitalism? Where is the case for constitutionalism and the idea that government may be necessary for a few narrow functions, but always to say no and to explain why when it goes beyond that? And the acquiescence, the surrender decades and decades ago on the income tax issue was, in a sense, the little stone that starts down the hill and becomes an avalanche of defeat.
Yeah, but they still have their mantras, though. I mean, their favorite mantra is free enterprise, private property, and limited government. You see it on conservative websites. You hear it in their speeches. I mean, they really have convinced themselves that they really stand for free enterprise, private property, and limited government. And I think that's why they resent us libertarians so much. We remind them of what they once were and what they still should be and could be. They would prefer that we just not be around to remind them of that so they can create this false dichotomy between them and liberals or progressives when they're all on the same page now. They all believe in the welfare state. They all believe in the warfare state. And unfortunately, Richard, there's libertarians now that take the same position. Hey, the big omnipotent state is here. We're tilting at windmills. We're wasting our time. We just need to accept that it's here and become better managers, become better regulators. We're going to be able to handle this system better than they are, which of course is not freedom. That's the point.
Yeah, you see, the issue becomes clearest, I think, when you're talking to some conservative friends, acquaintances, and you're commiserating about the state of modern society. And you ask too many conservatives, philosophical conservatives, well, if you could have a magic wand, what is it that you'd like government to do less or to do not at all anymore? And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, you get a blank look.
Right? Because they've lost their moorings.
Because they can't even imagine a world in which all or even a large number of the things that government has taken over the last 100 years would no longer be the responsibility of the political authority. And that itself is a damning statement about the philosophical views and philosophy of conservatism in not just the United States, but around the world.
Well, and especially among young conservatives. I mean, they grow up in this system and they're taught that it's freedom, and so they have no incentive to break their chains. They embody Johann Goethe's famous sentence quote, which is my favorite quote, I think, that there's no one more enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And this is what happens. You grow up in a system. You're indoctrinated in the government schools with this is freedom. This is free enterprise. You're convinced of it. And you're grateful that you live in this massive welfare warfare state funded by one of the most tyrannical agencies, if not the most tyrannical agency in U.S. history, the Internal Revenue Service, which has destroyed countless people, harassed people, abused people, sent people to jail for not paying their income taxes, which was totally contrary to what our ancestors considered was freedom. Now, we know there were some bad founding principles of America, slavery and so forth, but there were some good ones, Richard. And among the good ones was no income tax, no IRS, no forced charity. That was our heritage, and I think it's the abandonment of that heritage that put America on the wrong road, the road that we're now on, and we're now all paying a very big price for.
Well, let me just add that, because a lot of people say, oh, yeah, you talk about freedom, but what about slavery in the past? Or women from the start certainly didn't have equal rights and so on. There's a thing that we call the conscience, and it's that little voice in our head that most people find rattling around that constantly is telling them right from wrong. Did they do the right thing? Did they do the wrong thing? Did they really do something and deserve it? That type of thing. And given what the American founding was based on, individual liberty, freedom of enterprise, individuals being able to keep that which they had rightfully and honestly earned and produced, that government was to be a protector and not a redistributor. Once you have that idea in front of you publicly, and you say, well, by golly, I'm an American, and that's what I believe in, and then you have slavery, that eats away at people's conscience. It's like drops of acid slowly beating away a hard surface. How can you reconcile one group of men holding other human beings in permanent bondage when you say that all men are created equal? And that was the conscience, our philosophical principles that compelled us, pushed us, demanded that we confront this dichotomy and hypocrisy. And I would say that all the good things that began to overcome those original anomalies, slavery, lack of equal rights before the law for everyone, that eventually and slowly became that way, showed the power and the importance and the historical significance of those founding ideas, because it forced people over time to be more consistent in what they practiced as well as they preached, because otherwise it's like your conscience is always gnawing at you. And that is the strength of liberty. The principle of liberty makes you say, am I stealing from another person? Am I getting a favor at another person's expense? Am I denying someone else's freedom? And most people cannot handle that when they're confronted with it. And it nudges them, and therefore the society as a whole, in a more right direction. Now, I would argue that that is what we have to build upon and say, talk to our fellow Americans. Do you believe that an individual has certain rights to manage, control, direct his own life in his own way, as long as he's peacefully and honest? Does the individual have a right, as long as he's been honest and peaceful, to keep that which he has earned? Do you want someone to take what you've honestly earned? Do you believe that relationships should be based upon consent and agreement? Or do you think that some people could force others to do that which they would not agree to if they had the liberty to say no. That's what we have to confront our fellow Americans with, to, in a sense, make them rethink and understand the principles upon which the country was founded to help us move once more in that direction, and even in a better form than anything we've had in the past.
No, very profound thought. And you'll recall from the time we first started FFF, our very first month of publication, we talked about the need to dismantle these things like income taxation, the welfare state, and so forth, instead of reforming them. And for 30 years, we've been told, you're just too radical, Jacob. You need to modify your position to make it more palatable, like call for a lowering of income tax rates, rein in the IRS, and reduce Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, or phase it out over 30 years. Well, you mentioned slavery. Let's imagine that we live in 1855 America, and somebody comes up to you and says, I'm a libertarian, and I'm going to stand for reform of slavery, shorter work hours, fewer lashings, better food and health care, and we're going to phase out slavery over the next 30 years because it would be cruel to just end this system all at once. And nobody's ever going to accept just ending it all at once. So we got to be practical. And then you and I come along and say, oh, the heck with that. Slavery needs to be ended now, regardless of what the populace thinks, no matter what public opinion is. This is morally wrong. There's no phase out about it. There's no reform about it. End slavery now. And that's really the position, the only position to take right now with respect to this welfare, warfare state tyranny. These are times that cry out for libertarian leadership. You'll recall that book by Leonard Read, Elements of Libertarian Leadership. That's what we need right now, Richard.
Listen, I agree with you. And Jacob, if you were my slave, I can assure you that my phase out would not be more than 10 years.
I would be so grateful, Richard. I mean, I would be thankful that you would phase it out over 10 years instead of 30 years.
I'm just a nice guy.
You
What
really
can I
are.
say?
You're a great master. Thank you so much. On that note, we'll wrap it up. Come and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Visit us at ff.org. Send us some emails if you got questions. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks for your great support. And Richard, I'll see you next week.
Until next week. Thank you.